People who met Nick Reiner remember the same thing again and again, that nothing about him felt dangerous, nothing about him raised alarms, and nothing about his life hinted at the horror that would later leave two parents dead. This is not the story of a monster hiding in plain sight, but the story of how normal can be the most misleading mask of all. What happened inside the Reiner home was not sudden madness, not a random snap, and not a mystery without roots, because the truth was quietly building long before the night Rob and Michelle Reiner were killed. The signs were there, the tension was growing, and the silence inside that house was louder than anyone realized. This is where the story truly begins, before police lights, before headlines, and before Nick Reiner became a name tied forever to one of the most chilling family murders people still struggle to understand. Nick Reiner did not grow up in a home that people feared or avoided, and from the outside his family looked stable, structured, and ordinary in every way that society defines success. Rob and Michelle Reiner were known as caring parents who worked hard, kept their home together, and believed deeply in providing their son with opportunities they may not have had themselves. There were no public signs of abuse, no police calls, and no rumors that neighbors whispered about behind closed doors, which is why the case later shocked so many people who thought they understood what a dangerous home looked like. The Reiner house was quiet, clean, and calm, the kind of place people assume is safe simply because nothing ever seems wrong. Nick himself blended easily into the background, not loud, not violent, and not attention-seeking, which made it even harder for anyone to imagine him capable of extreme brutality. He looked like thousands of other young men trying to find their place in a world that keeps raising expectations without offering clear direction. Behind closed doors, however, a different reality was slowly forming, one built not on chaos but on pressure, emotional distance, and a growing sense of failure that Nick did not know how to explain or escape. What makes this case disturbing is not just what Nick did, but how invisible his collapse was until it was far too late. Rob Reiner believed in discipline and structure, and while he was not described as cruel, he carried strong expectations about responsibility, progress, and adulthood. Michelle Reiner was often seen as the emotional center of the family, trying to hold peace together while balancing concern for her son's future. Nick struggled with direction, identity, and purpose, issues many young people face, but in his case they became heavy and isolating rather than temporary obstacles. Instead of asking for help, he turned inward, allowing resentment and frustration to quietly shape his thoughts day after day. People close to the family later described Nick as distant in subtle ways, not angry, not explosive, but withdrawn, as if something inside him was slowly shutting down. He still spoke when spoken to, still followed routines, and still looked normal enough to avoid suspicion. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about the case, that Nick Reiner did not fit the image people rely on to feel safe, because he did not look broken, desperate, or unstable on the surface. He looked like someone who was simply going through a phase, someone who would eventually find his footing and move forward. Inside Nick's mind, however, pressure was building from every direction. Expectations he felt unable to meet and disappointment he believed he could never erase. The longer those feelings stayed unspoken, the more they transformed into something darker. Psychologists often explain that emotional isolation can be more dangerous than open conflict, because anger that is never expressed does not disappear, it mutates. In Nick's case, silence became the breeding ground for resentment, and resentment slowly turned into distorted thinking. Nick began to see his parents not as support, but as obstacles, reminders of what he was not becoming and mirrors reflecting his perceived failure. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not come with loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. It happened quietly, through small moments, through looks that felt judgmental even when they were not, through conversations that felt like pressure even when they were meant as guidance. Over time, Nick's emotional world narrowed until frustration felt permanent and escape felt impossible. Rob and Michelle, like many parents, believed time would fix what they could not fully understand, trusting that patience and consistency would guide their son forward. They had no reason to believe they were in danger, because nothing in Nick's behavior suggested immediate threat. What they did not see was the internal narrative Nick was building, one where blame slowly shifted away from himself and toward the people closest to him. In his mind, responsibility transformed into resentment, and guidance transformed into control. This psychological shift is critical to understanding what happened next, because the crime was not driven by sudden rage, but by a warped sense of justification that had been growing silently. Nick did not see himself as evil in his own mind. He saw himself as trapped. The idea of being stuck, of having no exit, can be terrifying to someone already emotionally unstable, and when that fear is left unchecked, it can lead to catastrophic decisions. Nick began to believe that the only way to end his suffering was to eliminate its source. That belief, once rooted, is extremely dangerous, especially when it forms without challenge or outside perspective. Nick did not reach out, did not confide in friends, and did not seek professional help in a way that could have changed the course of events. The isolation grew stronger, and the emotional distance between Nick and his parents widened, even though they continued living under the same roof. This disconnect created an illusion of normalcy while hiding a growing internal collapse. By the time the final night approached, Nick's thinking had become rigid and extreme, shaped by frustration, self-pity, and a belief that his parents were standing between him and peace. This is how normal lives slowly drift toward unimaginable violence without anyone noticing the shift. The tragedy of this case lies not only in the loss of Rob and Michelle Reiner, but in how preventable the outcome feels in hindsight. Looking back, people searched desperately for a clear warning sign, something obvious they could have pointed to. The truth is far more unsettling, because the warning signs were subtle, emotional, and easy to dismiss, especially in a world where quiet suffering often goes unnoticed. Nick Reiner did not scream for help. He disappeared emotionally while still being physically present. As night fell on the Reiner home, nothing seemed out of place to the outside world, and nothing suggested that this would be the last night Rob and Michelle would ever spend alive. The house remained quiet, the routines unchanged, and the illusion of safety intact. Inside Nick's mind, however, a decision was forming, one that would permanently destroy a family and leave a question that still haunts those who study the case. How does someone so ordinary cross a line so extreme? What came next after the murders was not the chaos people expected, but something colder and more disturbing. Nick Reiner did not break down in the way movies prepare us to see. He did not scream or collapse or beg for forgiveness. Instead, he moved through the aftermath like someone walking through a routine, as if the most violent moment of his life had already passed long before that night. When police questioned Nick, his words were calm and measured, almost rehearsed, and that alone sent chills through investigators. He spoke about his parents as if they were characters in a story rather than the people who raised him, and this emotional distance raised immediate red flags. It wasn't just what he said, but what he didn't say. No tears, no shaking, no visible regret. As the investigation deepened, detectives began piecing together Nick's behavior in the weeks and months before the murders. Friends described him as quiet but increasingly withdrawn, spending more time alone, disconnecting from reality in ways that seemed subtle at first. There were moments when he appeared frustrated by small things, but nothing that screamed danger. What shocked everyone was how well Nick had hidden what was happening inside him. Teachers, neighbors, and relatives all described him as normal, polite, and respectful, the kind of young man people trusted without hesitation. That normal image became the most terrifying part of the case, because it meant the warning signs were either invisible or ignored. Psychologists brought in to evaluate Nick began exploring his inner world, and what they found painted a troubling picture. Beneath the calm exterior was a growing sense of resentment and emotional detachment, a belief that he was misunderstood and trapped by expectations he never agreed to. This feeling did not explode suddenly. It slowly fermented in silence. Nick's relationship with his parents was not openly abusive, but it was emotionally complicated. Rob and Michelle Reiner were described as caring but structured, believing in rules, discipline, and responsibility. For Nick, this structure felt suffocating, like a life already decided for him without his consent. Instead of expressing his anger or confusion, Nick buried it deep, allowing it to grow into something darker. Experts believe this internal pressure created a fantasy world where violence became a solution, not an act of rage, but a release. That idea alone unsettled investigators because it meant the crime was not impulsive, but internalized. Digital evidence added another disturbing layer to the case. Investigators found searches, writings, and private thoughts that showed Nick was thinking about escape, control, and finality. None of it explicitly said murder, but together it formed a roadmap of a mind drifting toward a breaking point. The night of the murders was not fueled by a sudden argument or emotional explosion, according to evidence. It appeared calculated, quiet, and disturbingly controlled. This was not someone who snapped in the heat of the moment, but someone who had already crossed the line mentally long before he acted. When the court proceedings began, public opinion split sharply. Some saw Nick as a monster who deserved no sympathy, while others struggled to understand how a seemingly normal young man could commit such an act. The courtroom became a place where psychology, morality, and fear collided. Nick's defense focused heavily on his mental state, arguing that he was detached from reality and unable to process emotions normally. Prosecutors pushed back hard, pointing to the planning, the calm behavior, and the lack of immediate remorse as proof of intent. Every detail was dissected, every word weighed. What made the case even heavier was the absence of a clear motive that people could easily understand. There was no money dispute, no inheritance fight, no documented abuse, nothing that fit the usual true crime patterns. This forced the public to confront a terrifying truth. Sometimes violence does not come from obvious hatred. Families across the country watched the trial and saw something deeply unsettling in it. If someone like Nick could do this, what does normal even mean anymore? The case shattered the illusion that danger always looks dangerous, reminding everyone that the most horrifying threats can wear familiar faces. Psychologists later described Nick as emotionally disconnected rather than emotionally explosive. He did not act out of rage, but out of emptiness, a desire to erase what he felt trapped inside. That emptiness, according to experts, is far harder to detect and far more dangerous. The sentencing marked the final chapter of a story that never truly ends for the families involved. Nick faced the reality of what he had done, not through emotion, but through consequence. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, heavy with grief that no sentence could undo. Rob and Michelle Reiner were remembered not for how they died, but for the lives they lived and the love they gave. Friends spoke of their kindness, their dedication, and their belief in family, a belief that makes the betrayal even harder to comprehend. Their absence left a permanent void. Even today, the case continues to haunt those who study it. It is often referenced in discussions about hidden mental health struggles and the dangers of emotional isolation. Nick Reiner became a symbol of how quiet suffering can turn into irreversible destruction when left unseen. This story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people closest to us. It challenges the idea that evil is always loud, always obvious, always easy to spot. Sometimes it grows quietly, in plain sight, behind a normal smile. Nick Reiner looked normal, and that is what makes this case unforgettable. Not because of the violence alone, but because it shattered the belief that normal equals safe. And in that realization, the real horror of this story truly lives.